In this lecture, we're going to get into a little bit more detail about paradigm design. So in the previous lecture, we saw how going from, in this case, an event-related design with constant inner stimulus interval, where the signal increases, only varies about a little bit. By varying the inner stimulus interval, we can get much more contrast from our event-related design, almost rivaling what we can sometimes see with a block design. So this brings up a number of questions. That is, what should the average inner stimulus interval be, or what are the number of stimuli? How clumped together should the stimuli be? That is, how should they be more block-like or more spread apart versus more of an event-related design? How much should you jitter or vary the response? And how should you jitter? That is, what distribution should these inner stimulus intervals have? So that's what I'll explore in more detail in this particular lecture. First, a couple of definitions. When I refer to detection, I'm referring to running an analysis where we have an assumed response shape. So for example, here, where we have the response to 3 particular stimuli or brief tasks, shown in the gray. One way to model that would be to assume a particular shape of the hemodynamic response, convolve that with the response timing, and then fit that response to the data. And as we've seen in previous lectures, the hypotheses would be, is that beta weight significantly different from 0 or not? The null hypothesis being that it would be 0. We express that as an equation, as that the signal is this design matrix times our beta weights plus noise. And we can calculate a statistic, the t-statistic, to determine how well this particular response fits. And that is just the beta weight divided by the standard deviation of that beta weight, which is equal to the standard deviation of the noise times the square root of this particular element in the covariance matrix. This is actually what we have control over and what we can vary to try to optimize our particular design. So detection efficiency, I will call 1 over the square root of this particular element in the covariance matrix. That is, the higher the detection efficiency, the better we are able to detect the response. In contrast, if we're interested in a more deconvolution type of analysis, where we're interested in estimating the shape of the response, another way to say that is that we don't want to have a fixed response shape, but rather we want to vary that or have a more flexible parameterization of that response function shape. In this case, again, we can write this as an equation that the signal is some design matrix times our betas plus noise. And again, very similarly, the statistic is the beta divided by the standard deviation. And this, again, is what we have control over. This is well, we don't have control over the noise, but we do have control over this particular design matrix. That is how we actually design whatever regressors we use to model this response. And in this case, instead of having just a single activation amplitude, that's a single beta weight with an error bar on it, we have multiple points that we're estimating, each with its own error bar on it. And we can take the sum of these as a measure of the estimation accuracy. That is, it's the trace of that covariance matrix, which I'm going to call the estimation accuracy. So let's take a look at this in greater detail. What about the number of stimuli that you should have? So if you're considering 2 conditions, like a task and a control condition, here what I'm plotting is the detection efficiency. Again, this is using a fixed response shape, but you'd actually find the same thing with even for the deconvolution kind of analysis. And I'm plotting this versus the percent of time spent in the task state. And what you find out is that the optimal kind of design is where you balance the amount of time spent in the 2 different states, in this case, the task and the control state. Okay, so should you have these stimuli more clumped together, or should they be more separate? So that's what I'm showing you here. In the blue line is what you're seeing with a constant inner stimulus interval. And you can see that as the stimulus duration or minimum stimulus duration decreases, that response decreases down. But if you vary that inner stimulus interval, as I'm showing here in the different circles, you can actually still get a nice response, even at very short minimum stimulus durations. But what you see here is that in general, the detection power is higher the more block-like you get. That is, if you block the stimuli together in these larger clumps or go to a block design stimulus, these block designs are generally better for detection given a fixed response shape. In contrast, event-related designs, that is where the stimuli is more random over time, are generally better for these deconvolution type analysis where we're estimating the impulse response function shape. Now, briefly, this difference between detection and estimation, that is using a fixed response shape versus estimating the response shape, can be understood by looking at what's going on in Fourier space. So this explanation is for those of you who have some knowledge about what's Fourier transforms. So for example, if we have the bold response, we can model that as a stimulus timing convolved with some impulse response function shape. And what's happening in the frequency domain is that this is the same as the Fourier transform of our stimulus timing multiplied by this low pass filter. So if we're interested in detecting this response, we want large changes, as large signal changes as possible. So we want to put most of the information at these lower frequencies because the higher frequencies are being filtered. So because of these block designs are generally better. However, if we're interested in finding out what this shape of the impulse response function is, then one way we can do that is we can send in all possible frequencies, essentially white noise, and find out what comes out. This is sort of the best way of estimating what that filter actually is. So if we're interested in estimating the response function shape, we're really interested in finding out what that filter characteristic looks like. And because of that, we want to send in something that kind of looks like white noise, which is essentially an event-related kind of design. Another question you might have is, okay, so how do we actually generate a stimulus with a variable interstimulus interval or stimulus onset asynchrony? Well, conceptually, most people think of this as we have a certain times at which events occur, and we're just going to jitter where they occur in time. And certainly, that's one way you could generate these times. But another way, and this is actually how a lot of the computer programs do this, is to randomize the order of the events. That is, if you know that you want to spend 50% of the time in one task and 50% of the time in another, say, control condition, you could consider a certain grid of times when we want certain tasks to occur, and then place exactly half, in this case, like half blue marbles, half red marbles or orange marbles, and then just simply randomize the order that these events occur. And by doing so, we've actually jittered or varied the timing between these. And it turns out this is actually the optimal way of randomizing the order of these events and randomizing the interstimulus interval. However, still some people want to think of the first one, that is, how much do you need to vary things? So here I've just simulated what goes on with, in this case, going from a constant SOA of 8 seconds and jittering it by varying amounts. And what you can see here is that, it increases the more you vary it, the better your detection efficiency. And it plateaus out at about 8 seconds, in this case, basically when you've completely randomized those timings. That is when it's going instead of a constant 8-second interstimulus interval or SOA, being varying plus minus 8 seconds. This is assuming that we keep the number of stimuli the same. Another thing to consider is what distribution of the stimulus onset asynchrony should have. Turns out that the optimal distribution is actually an exponential distribution. That is, we have a lot of very short stimulus onset asynchronies or interstimulus intervals and just a few long ones. And here's what you can see what you get when you have different kinds of fractions of either fractions of task versus rest and what the optimal order should be. Turns out this is actually exactly what you get when you randomize your order of the events. This is the kind of distribution you get of SOAs. Another consideration is, what if you have multiple task types? Let's say in this case, we've got a task A, task B, and some control condition. And perhaps we're also interested in the general linear test, the GLT. That is, what is the difference in the activation amplitude between these conditions A and B? So what should the proportion of time spent in each of these tasks be? Well, let's look at this in stimulation for different kinds of contrasts. If our general linear test matrix looks like this, that is, we're only interested in task A versus control. So remember, everything here, we're modeling task stimulus A versus control, stimulus B versus control, control being sort of a baseline C. So in this case, if we're only interested in A, then it says, well, spend 50% of the time doing stimulus A and no time at all doing stimulus B, because if we're not interested in it, why bother doing it, right? Same thing as if we're only interested in task B, the simulation says, well, spend 50% of the time doing task B, the rest of it control and don't bother with collecting A. Okay, so what if we're interested in the difference between task A and task B? In this case, the simulation would tell us spend 50% of the time in task A, 50% of the time in task B, and that means no task at all, no time at all in task C, or the control condition. Or what if we're interested equally in task A, task B, and compared to the control condition, in this case, rest? Well, in that case, it says, well, maybe spend equal time in each, right? Some time, maybe a third of the time in task A, third of the time in B, and the rest in the resting state. So I think that's important to consider. Consider, first of all, this A versus B. This is kind of a surprising result because, well, if we have two different kinds of tasks, usually we think of, we might want to have some sort of control condition. What this is saying really is that if we're only interested in the difference between the two, then really our optimal design is to spend all of our time just collecting those two tasks and look at that difference. However, I think it's important to remember oftentimes that we are interested not just in that difference, but also in these individual tasks versus the control condition. So a good example of this might be, let's say you're interested in finding out the differences in visual activation to faces versus houses. And you might say, well, what proportion of the time should I be showing faces versus houses? You could spend all your time showing these different stimuli, and you see that subtle difference in between. However, if you don't see any difference, what you don't know is that were both of these visual cortex areas similarly active compared to just a fixation baseline, or were they not active at all? However, if you actually have some time in a control condition as well, now you can actually compare both the task A versus the control, B versus the control, and the difference between the two. So because of this, I would recommend still having some sort of baseline condition. That is, you could actually run a slightly different analysis. You could look at, let's look first at all the areas that are active versus just the fixation baseline. And then within those areas, look more closely at seeing what's different about, for example, faces versus houses. So just something to keep in mind, that oftentimes, even though we can mathematically determine these kinds of contrasts and see this is what I want to optimize, there's often more kinds of contrast that we're actually interested in. So hopefully I've given you a bit more intuitive understanding and perhaps more some rules of thumbs to follow when considering paradigm design.